This is Rick, the Butcher of Names. And this is your seat at the table. Why didn't the Elves do more to save Arnor, both from itself and from the clutches of the Witch Queen? That is the question we are going to muddle about with today, right? That's my thought. So my first thought was the Elven relationship with Arnor and his people. We assume, and it's always been my speculation, that the faithful of Elendil settled in Arnor for several key reasons. One, of course, being it's the ancestral homeland of the didn before they moved west to the Beleriand and became embroiled in the Elvish and Morgoth conflicts. But also because there's the largest existing concentration of high elves, the Noldor specifically, are located on and around the boundaries of what is to become Arnor. And it's given that, in my opinion, the faithful specifically, but the Dunedain and the High Dunedain specifically, the faithful, have this unhealthy crush on all things Elvish, and they absolutely want to be as close to these people as possible. And it makes from that perspective, it makes perfectly good sense that Elendil, the High King of the surviving Dunedain after the fall of Numenor, would come and settle in Arnor. And the relationships with the elves have always been on good terms for the most part with the Dunedain, the Numerians prior to that, and specifically certain elements within the Numerian culture, i.e. the faithful and people who, in their eyes, are rational and not under the thrall of evil designs and intentions brought about by Sauron's meddling and the unhealthy views and beliefs that grew up from this obsession with death and the belief that the elves are withholding immortality from the High Dunedain. And when we look at the perception from that point, by the time Arnor, the Elendil arrives in Arnor, there's already a reasonably sized population of lesser Dunedain who had fled from Numenor in the previous generations or two and settled in the region. Far more of them settled in the south, specifically in the vales of the White Mountains between the ocean and the sea and the mountains, as well as the Anduin Valley and further points south and east, such as Umbar and other enclaves all throughout Middle-earth. The number of the Dunedain in Arnor would be marginal, probably in the hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple 100,000, maybe less, as opposed to, say, in Gondor, where you were probably in a million plus the lesser men or the middlemen that inhabited large numbers there. The elves enclaves are what's the last vestiges of Elvish culture and civilization in Middle-earth, specifically for the Noldor, for the High Elves, who the survivors who fled the fall of Beleriand and the destruction of the lands to the west during the First Age. And originally, there were several large concentrations, and the bulk of them settled either in Lindon, this area between the Blue Mountains and the sea, and the river, and what do they call that? The mouth of the river. There's the Gulf of Loon is what it's referred to on the maps, and then in Ostas and Edel, and yes, I butcher the place names. That does not mean I don't understand what they are, and who they are, and how they pertain to most relevant material in Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien's works as best as I know it. Even if I can't pronounce a lot of the names, I can just ask you for forgiveness and to bear with me. But you know what I'm referring to, or I'll eventually get around to close proximity, the pronunciation. Meanwhile, I welcome those comments. You keep them coming, and together maybe I'll improve. But I'll tell you, 53 going on 54, and my handwriting has never improved. So it's the likely to be what we have, and we will work what we have. So we have a significant population in Linden, and enough so that there's a number of sizable towns, Elvish towns and communities and cities. You got two cities specifically. You have the Mythlog, which is for Linden and Harlinden, depending, for Linden being on the north side of the Gulf and Harlinden on the south side of the Gulf. But there's also some place maps that show other settlements of Noldar elves. If you look at and we're not going to go into a big treatise on elving culture and the divisions of elves and specifics, but the more rustic they get, the less inclined they are to create what we would consider modern domiciles. You don't see, if you go to the wood elves realm, the majority of the elves live in trees or in the woods or migrate around. They do not build settlements of any significant size and length of time. That is more of a Noldar Vanir thing, where they like culture and structure and security, and embrace not just wood but stone and water and many other substances to create some pretty fantastic stuff. I have a game mod source book for MERP for Osnell and Holland, and eventually I'll be able to review it. And then one of the things that they stressed in there was that it would have been considered, and that city would have been the peak of Elvish construction and technology in Middle Earth and Western Middle Earth specifically. It's hard to say what's in the Far East, although it's assumed that very few Noldar returned to the East. Most of them came after Morgoth or followed their oaths and their kin, and then lingered, and then are still lingering, and in small numbers are slowly returning to the Undying Lands. The Sylvan Elves, what don't go to the Undying Lands, will eventually fade away into very rustic, hidey little communities, and then eventually, I imagine, fade away completely. So we have the largest concentration of elves in Western Middle Earth, in Linden specifically, and I believe that to be there for good reason. Now, Lothlorn is established sometime later. Rivendell is established sometime later. It's important to note that Rivendell itself is not really a city. It is called the last homely house, or the first homely house, depending on how you look at it. It's a refuge and Elrod's manors estate, if you want to look at it that way. So the population levels in that community are not going to be as massively high as you will find here. So the bulk of Elvish numbers are here, and we have to consider briefly the numbers. Elves are immortal. They don't breed like rabbits. They don't have children like humans do. They don't crank out 20 or 30 generations of elves, because they could. They could easily have overrun the world if they were prone, or they were driven to do a lot of south population, if you will, to be polite. Probably the average elf family consists of one or two, maybe three offspring. For an immortal race, for an entire age, that's pretty small. And so we don't know the exact numbers of Noldar that came east over in the first age, and it had to be in the numbers of millions or tens of millions, because of the sheer numbers of people who die in the conflict throughout the latter half of the first age, and the final destruction of the Valorant. So huge numbers of elves, and while they were still repopulating, they were having children. Those children, generationally speaking, would not be sufficient enough to replace the losses suffered during all the trials and tribulations and conflicts that they pursued. And that is an honest opinion, and I believe others share it. Other people on the internet who are fascinated with this material follow that without that precept that is a decline, and there was never going to be a large number of elves. Significant replacements don't happen. In extremely rare cases like Glorfindel, who's reported to have died and gone to the halls of waiting in Mandos, and Mandos believed that he had still yet much to do, and reunited him with his corporal form, and then give him the permission to return to Middle Earth to continue in what it is his ultimate fate is to be. So we look at these key realms and suspected populations. So we have Linden, and I'm of the assumption by the time of the end of Arthedain, the numbers of elves were probably in the hundreds of thousands. At the beginning of the settlement, before the last alliance, there probably was 1 million plus, give or take, Noldar and Sylvan elves living in the western enclaves and cities of London. And there's probably 10 or 20,000 living in and around in Holland, in and around Austin and El, and probably a few thousand in Lothlorien until Austenel falls and the survivors flee, and some would flee through Moria with Galadriel to take up abode in Lothlorien, or what becomes Lothlorien. It's well established that Elora leads a number of survivors north and founds in Mladris or Rivendell, and there's probably a significant number who fled to the west and the protection of London as best they could, and not including the ones who would have just taken ship to the west immediately because of the deportations of Sauron and his forces. So we look at the population in fairly modest numbers compared to humans. So what are the elves' motives for helping the humans, specifically the Dunedain? Because there's very few cases for large elven actions or efforts on the behalf of the middlemen or the lesser men. The hillmen, the Dunlandings, most of them are highly superstitious, very low tech, and in most cases utterly terrified of the elves, viewing them as some sort of demon or inhuman, whatever. And they do their best to avoid contact, so they don't encourage it. The elves would not meddle. So this, we're talking specifically the Dunedain, and more likely the High Dunedain, who still have connections and a deep understanding of human or elven motives. For the lion's share, before the last alliance, I believe that the elves that survived the fall of Beleriand and moved and fled eastward to join the Sylvan elves and wood elves and so on and so forth that already exist in Middle Earth is because they're not quite ready to give up on the wilderness and the beauty of the living world to go to the Undying Lands. And I think that's a video on for another a topic for another video of its own, about how alive the elves must feel in a living land that's in constant flux and change, and how they can weary of it fairly quickly. And if they can't find amusement and enjoyment in the watching of the seasons come and go, and these hyper active younger race of humans doing what they do, the elves would have all packed up and shop and left for the Undying Lands as soon as the seas settled after the fall of Ballarat. That's just my opinion on that subject. So when we look at the trade and economics, the elven motives for helping the humans, well, for a part, I don't think that the humans or the elves are going to go and go into great effort to coddle the humans, because it's not really their job. They're here to enjoy the twilight of their time in Middle Earth to the best of their ability. The contact would be as limited as possible. The only real motivations is a sense of obligation of like an older brother looking after a younger sibling, or the idea that we stand alone, we stand together, we have a chance of surviving, we stand alone, and we're going to get picked off by the enemy. The fact that the elves enclaves in the West are protected by lots of human communities and settlements of mostly what do you call unruly, low-tech human settlement or tribes or clans, with a handful of the Dunedain, Lesser Dunedain, putting some order in place. It gives them a buffer, a protection from Cirdan, because in the earliest eras of the Second Age, during the conflict between the Elves and Cirdan, it is established that the Cirdan's forces get almost to London before Numer steps in and utterly crushes it. And so there was a good chance, had the Cirdan's forces continued to the west, it would have routed the Elven communities in London and severely hindered any kind of ability for the Elves to have been pertinent in later conflicts, and most certainly would not have been there for the last alliance. That, of course, is just my opinion on it. The trade and economics of the regions, I talked to this in one of my other videos for quite a bit, so I'm going to touch on it vaguely. There's still some need for trade between the elves and the rest of the Middle Earth, specifically humans, giving them the Dunedain, Lesser Dunedain, their descendants, can act as middlemen for other materials, luxury goods, items that they can't create themselves or don't have a desire to. It's not going to be large bulk goods. You're not going to see barrels of fish being delivered to London or the Forest Realm. Barrels of wine, absolutely. Luxury items, silks from the Far East, stuff that the elves would be time-consuming, labor-intensive to produce themselves, but they don't need large numbers of huge bulk items. So the economic reasons are going to be very marginal at best. They are not going to suffer when Arnor collapses and Arthedain collapses, and there's, for the most part, no serious human interaction in what is Arnor in the future. So trade and economics, I don't think, play a huge role. This brings me to my next point of subtle protection and teaching. We're back to that big brother, little brother, or big sister, little sister mindset. I think that the elves would take it it's in their interest and their possibly part of their duty to help combat the rising tide of evil as it comes and goes. This is what their crucial motivator for getting involved in the last alliance would have been. Now they're still fighting Morgoth's legacy. They still feel obligated to rid Middle Earth of unfettered evil, as it's seen in as the representation of Sauron and his minions. And to help deal with this, the elves are going to do a little bit of protection. They're not going to mount regular patrols, or work with the Arthedain military to combat the forces of the Witch King. And had they done so, things might have turned differently. And then again, it might have made the Sauron ratchet things up and decide he needed to deal with the elves as well as the humans up here, and harshly as much as possible, as decidedly as much as possible. So the elves provide subtle protection when and where they deem it necessary in small numbers, and on the rare occasion of joining with the human forces to combat a major offensive. The very end of Arthedain's existence sees this. The elves finally march to confront the Witch King in force. They're joined by a military force coming out of Gondor. I suspect, had the military force from Gondor not come, I think the elves might have continued to sit on the fence and see what was going to happen. Some of the real wise would have been aware of the Witch King, potentially his backstory, if you will, or who he really was, or they would have suspicions of it and might have divined that the ultimate goal was the destruction of the human high Dunedain society in the north, and that they would no longer, once that end game was completed, that the Witch King would go back to the east or go back to Mordor, and the kingdom of the Witch King would, in one way or another, would cease to be a threat to them, and they may have just sat on the fence. The other side of the coin, or the other pillar of their keep to themselves philosophy, but keep an eye on the neighbors, would be subtle teachings. I believe that the elves, when the opportunity presented themselves, taught key High Dunedain knowledge and skill and wisdom, fighting prowess and technology, better weapon making, or at least slowed down the Numerian decline. Because once Numer is gone and the Arnor and Gondor are settled, there's no the reverse is on. Their age, their extended lifespan start to slow down. Their technological grasp starts to slide, because all you got to look at the construction of things like the outer wall of Minas Tirith and Orthanc and a number of other places of high Numerian construction techniques and high Numerian knowledge is never repeated again. Gimli makes a comment when he gets and he arrives in Minas Tirith that there's some good work here and some not so much. So I think the lesser stuff came at later times as the Dunedain slid and lost ground and traction. So it would be to the advantage of the elves. We see this later after the fall of Arthedain, when Elrod takes it upon himself to tutor and teach and keep an eye on Elladel's line leading up to Aragon. How much it varied from century to century or generation to generation, but I imagine he still kept his hand in there, and he had an alternate motive for doing so. Let's be honest with that. Elrod is the descendant; he's the uncle. He is the living uncle to Aragon's ancient great grandfather Elros, who was Elrod's brother. So he's seen a number of possible reasons for doing so. Then we turn to overt protection. The only time we ever see the elves of Lindon, in specifics, become involved with humans in dealing with Middle Earth affairs is the War of the Last Lands, and a little bit of interjection into the War of the Ring. Although it's stipulated most of their conflicts with the War of the Ring took place in the north, in the Unduin Valley, under the eaves of Mirkwood. But the forces of Lindon, the Elves of Lindon, were not involved in the War of the Ring. They did not send a host forward to help Helm's Deep. That host in the book doesn't exist. In the novel, it doesn't exist. Elrod's sons and a handful of retainers, as well as the 30 rangers that ride from the north that can be gathered in the amount of time that they had, really was a representation of that. There was no great Elvish battalion arriving at the gates of Helm's Deep in the novels. Looks great in the movies. Honestly, it does. And we see that Gilland or Gilland or whatever his name was, that was the warden of Lothlorien, is there, and he dies in defending the humans. This is one of those huge overt protection. We might see the occasional scattering, or the occasional elf who rides with the Dunedain on a mission, or the occasional band of wandering elves that come in conflict with or contact with elements of the enemy and fight them, but they're not going to go out of their way in large numbers. There's good reasons for this. If we look at the Undying, first off, an immortal person, immortal being, in my opinion, probably remembers everything to some limited degree or some vast degree. They have this, especially if you believe in the meditation, the sleepy meditation time that they take, lets them relive their life and elements in it, good and bad, I imagine. Sheer numbers of elves who die in the Last Alliance is like the last hurrah for the elvish nations of Middle Earth. They just do not have vast reserves of soldiers. when we see the conflict in the Battle of the Five Armies at Eredor, some 50 years earlier. This is just a token of what the Elvish hosts would have been like in the Last Alliance. Thunderil arrives with a pretty significant force of his Wood Elves, and not to knock Peter Jackson's vision of this, I find it unlikely that the Woodland Realms combat forces look anything like they do in the movie. That's just too Noldor for me. They're too uniform. They're too heavily equipped for Sylvan elves. I don't care how many Noldor there are. There surely isn't enough of Noldor in the Woodland Realm to put that kind of formation into place. I don't believe that would have been. I think it would have been more rustic, more heavier with the archers, and less on the swordsman aspects of things. It looks great in a movie, but it doesn't translate into really making sense to me. I think the elements later, and we see in Lord of the Rings, where we see the guards and the always made captain and Legolas fighting the orcs in the woods in that manner that they do, much more acceptable for what you would suspect a Sylvan-dominated Elvish realm would contain. And we go to numbers. I don't think there's no point where it ever says exactly how many elves are living in northern Mirkwood, but I suspect it's in the tens of thousands if we go by a viable population model. Now, the viable population model really isn't pertinent to elves as it is to humans. The Arnorian survivors of Arthedain, in order for the chieftains to have a population worthy of a bloodline being maintained of a high king, and to be able to put in the field a group of a very elite ranger, elite trained soldiers, there had to be, as I said in prior videos, there has to be a certain percentage of population. So you need, depending on who you ask, it's between 400 and 4,000, or 400 or 500 and 5,000, depending on who you ask in our real world specialists on this subject. But when it comes to elves, first off, the elves don't really care about progeny in the aspect that we're here to populate and to spread out and to consolidate and grow our holdings. They never came to Middle Earth in the first place for that purpose. They went to the Undying Lands. They were led there by the Valor and the mayor that served the Valor. And then, because of their great leader, the Noldor leader anyway, I think it's Finrod or Fingolfin, somebody, one of the Finns, got really upset that Morgoth took his shiny gemstones away and made a horrible vow to get them back. And millions of Noldar, pretty much the entire population of Noldar, packed up and followed him back to the Middle Earth. And it's the remnants of those who are in charge of the Sylvan elements, the quote dark elves, the ones that never saw the light of the trees, that did not travel to the shores of the Undying Lands, etc., etc. So in Vol's numbers, the Woodland Realms probably, like I said, 10,000 maybe, and they're not popping out new elves every 100 years. They're very few and far in between. So population growth is not really an important thing, and they understand that Noldar specifically know eventually the clock's ticking, and they're going to make that journey, or they're going to fade away one way or another, through attrition, through despair, through an urge, and an uncontrollable urge to go. So, bring it to another point. Why the Grey Havens isn't assailed by Cirdan? Well, we established that prior to the fall of Numr arrives and prevents this from happening. So the Cirdan's forces got fairly close, relatively, to the large concentration of elves in Lindon, but not so much that there was a major conflict here. The Numerians arrived specifically at Tharabad, but also in the Gulf of Lune and at the Lune River, and then marched and crushed the Cirdan's forces of the Second Age and captured. Well, they captured Cirdan, but in reality, they forced Cirdan to surrender. That was he felt a very clever option, is to actually give the illusion of giving in. So we look at that and we think about it. From then on out, what are the motivations or goals for Gilligad and then later Cirdan from London? Well, Gilligad is the High King of the Elves. It's through his banner and his call that the rest of the elves of the Western Middle Earth will rally together and form these combative hosts or involve themselves in, quote, world affairs. Gilligad's primary goals, I'm of the assumption, is to buy time for those who are not yet ready to go back to the Undying Lands to make that trip. Those who are lingering and in the twilight of the elvish existence in the Middle Earth. His goals would be to protect London, specifically the population, and wherein possible, the populations of Rivendell and Lothlorien as well. So later, when it becomes extremely apparent that Sauron's regained his strength, has reappeared, and is going to be a major threat to everybody in Middle Earth, specifically Western Middle Earth, exclusively the Elves for sure, that at this point Gilligad goes to Elendil, or sends accepts Gilligal's treaty, and together they form the last alliance of elves and men and march on Sauron to take the war to Sauron. We're going to fight him on our terms, but on his ground, and we're going to crush him. And it takes him 7 years. My understanding that battle took place for 7 years. They laid siege to Mordor, and it was a brutal. So you imagine 7 years of attrition. A lot of Dunedain died. A lot of High Dunedain died. A large section of the cream of Arnor's male population dies in that 7 years. This is one of the reasons that Tolkien says that Arnor's doomed to destruction in the end, because they lost the best and the brightest, and they lost enough numbers that the slide for this long-lived wraith was on. Well, if that was applicable to the humans, how much more devastating was the losses of the Elvish forces to the Elvish populations? I mean, honestly, how terrible would that have been? I can't, in my mind, imagine that this is also the death knell for any seriously long-term survival of the Elvish race in Middle Earth. That Gilligad has to understand that this is not likely to end well, and even though he's obliged in his mind to tackle Sauron. It's this: we need to clean up our mess, and here's yet another segment of Morgoth's mess. But as for Cirdan, who takes over for Gilligad, Cirdan is the gatekeeper. He is the shipmaster, the maker of ships. He keeps the doors open for the Elvish population to egress from Middle Earth. And his goals are not the same as Gilligad's. So when Cirdan is handed the title, he probably, in my mind, I don't ever hear him list the High King Cirdan. I think he passed that title. It ends up in the hands of Selden and Galadriel, or however you pronounce Galadriel's husband's name, and to some small degree Elrond. It's up to them to make those grand decisions of what to do. This is why we don't see any. When they call it the last alliance of men and elves, it's for good reason. In the books, you never see another one. Yes, there are times when elvish contingents fight alongside the men. We see that at the Battle of the Five Armies. We see that in the conflicts between the elves and the orcs in southern Mirkwood during the war, the last days of the War of the Ring. This is more of a diversionary tactics that were successful than any true intent of taking the war to Sauron directly. So Cirdan's goals from hence after the War of the Last Alliance, from there on out, his sole motivation is to keep London as safe as possible, to protect what population they do have, and to keep the gateways open and the flow of departing elves going. And it's why he doesn't get actively involved in Arnor's conflicts and the earliest days of Arnor's conflicts with the Witch King. There's no evidence that he does anything significant, or any of the Elvish leadership does anything significant throughout the decline of Arnor. And then this evaporates even more when Arnor is split up into three little client countries, and Radur and Carlin and Arthedain are pretty much on their own. And toward the very last days, and a hope to stave off the utter destruction of Arnor's ruling family, is when Cirdan sends forces alongside the forces from Gondor to do what they do. And at the end of the day, it's Glorfin that led the host, and they defeated the forces of the Witch King utterly, to the point where the Agma becomes defunct as well. But it doesn't matter, because, and some can make, well, it was a perfect victory, but it's not a perfect victory, because the Witch King and his master Cirdan couldn't care a sheep's fart about any of their forces in Agmar, or Agmar itself, as a base of power, because it's not, and it never was intended to be one other than temporary. And the fact that they succeeded in crushing Arnor and reducing it to this hidden core people and fleeing survivors served a purpose, and they were fine with it, which is the way it went. So the Elves turned around, went back to London, and went back to Rivendell, and went on about their lives, and then continued their subtle protections and subtle teachings when and where they could. So that brings us to why the Greyhavens rarely get involved with Arnor's politics and wars. Well, we're back to that. First off, the Elves are diminishing in numbers every year. Numbers are leaving every year. It probably fluxes up and down, but they're still getting fewer and fewer of them. And Mannish races are becoming more and more dominant. It's Uru's plan for Middle Earth, and the high wisest of the Elves understand this, and it's really not their place, and they understand that too, to get heavily involved in human affairs. Second, when Arnor devolves into three client states, at this point, the Elves probably shook their heads sadly and stepped back and washed their hands of most of it, because they're not going to allow themselves to get drawn into petty conflicts between these three